Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
We are the Steinmetz brothers, and this is the Pseudo Scholars Podcast, where we believe science isn't just for scientists. We think that science is for anyone with integrity who honestly wants to know more about the world. Each week, we grapple with reality by challenging what we think we know about topics, and we cover a diverse spectrum of difficult and misunderstood topics, and we ask hard questions about them.
Questions like, is nuclear proliferation going to end the world in the next couple of years? Or genetic engineering, is CRISPR technology going to be ready for use in your bathrooms in the next 5 years? Or energy transformation, are all of the energy companies in the Houston area going to be extinct as electric vehicles become commercialized and more common for everyday use? We want to cover all of these types of topics. We do the research, we analyze the data, and then hopefully everyone is going to leave with a more informed, stimulated, and inspired opinion about all of these matters. And so today, we're going to jump into a new topic that we haven't covered. It's all about space exploration. So as usual, we like to kind of set it up and give you guys a little bit of a framework for how we're going to move through the content. But firstly, we're going to obviously do a little bit of history on space exploration so we can understand where we are. We also want to ask the question, why are the pseudo scholars and other people such huge advocates for continued and advanced space exploration? And then lastly, what's to come? What's new in the world of space exploration? Are we going to be going to Mars in the next few years? This is how we're going to cover the content. So Shane, let's jump in.
All right, so we're going to start by trying to frame this, as you said. Why do people care so much about space exploration? Why is it one of my favorite topics in the world? And I think it has to do with the fascination, humanity's fascination with the unknown. For tens of thousands of years, humanity has created substitute explanations to try to explain that which exists that they can't explain, that thing that's just out of reach, space, the heavens. We've created these concepts of palaces and streets of gold that exist above us. The stars are truly gods. All of these different ideas that humans have created as a way of explaining what's going on out there. But we're happy to live in a lifetime where scientific discovery has told us quite a bit more about those things and dispelled so many myths. Really, in the last 100 years since the advent of the Hubble telescope, have we had the ability to truly zoom out and confirm that stars are not gods, and the Earth certainly isn't the center of the universe. I think now we know enough to know how little we know. So the point is that we are massive, massive universe that exists out there. We are a tiny speck of dust inside of that universe, and we're fascinated with trying to understand it better because it probably answers some questions about our own existence, about ourselves. So to me, space represents the greatest unknown. It represents the last frontier, and our human nature and our deep desire to understand and explore and grasp that unknown has us reaching, Cade. And that's why we're kind of in place now, maybe more than ever before, to really reach out and start touching stuff that we've never touched before.
So how did space travel all kind of rise on the scene, especially in the 50s and 60s that everyone knows about in the space race and things like that? Where did all of this come from?
It's an interesting history, and it starts with missile technology, really, and German engineers who were exported all around the world after World War II. People don't often know that the majority of the best missile technologists during that time of the world, in the late 1940s, were German. And after World War II, they still had wonderful information and knowledge to share, but they weren't going to be able to do a lot of great work after the fall of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. So these guys exported themselves and went around the world. Many of them came to the United States, and we have them to thank for the advent of our early missile systems, as do the Soviets and their early missile systems and their early technology. And one of those early missile technology systems was able to launch a satellite called Sputnik. We've all seen it before, probably in Google Images or something. That cute little rocket or cute little satellite that floats around. And it was the very first thing that ever existed outside of our orbit. The Soviets launched it in 1957. And I think, Cade, that was the beginning of the space race, because competition truly breeds success, doesn't it? It wasn't that long after that NASA was created, no surprise, in response to the Soviets launching Sputnik, because we were nervous about the Soviets gaining this understanding of the final frontier of the space world and us not having the ability to match their capabilities. So the space race was on, but we were not the first into space. A guy named Yuri Gagarin, I think I'm saying that correctly, a Soviet cosmonaut, was the first into space in 1959, but we were not far on his heels.
It's pretty interesting because when you think about it, it was all about perception of who is the world power, right? There was not a lot of practical things about space that we understood at that point in time. We didn't understand the advancements. We didn't understand the effects that it was going to have. It was all about who's the king, who's the best, who's the most competitive, who can win the race. And I think it's really ironic that it was really the battle of two different, economic and political systems, and it was communism in Russia and capitalism in the States. And so capitalism is obviously more known because you have more players in the competitive market, which is hopefully part of the reason why we ended up winning. So there is a brighter side to what happened after 1959, and we lost kind of the first leg of the relay. We really came back strong. That's when the U.S. decided to start funding the Apollo missions, right? So everyone knows this kind of from the Tom Hanks videos and things like that in the old movies, but we really spent an exceptional amount of money on the Apollo missions. And that was like $205 billion when you take into account inflation, which is also something we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the podcast because we really want to cover how that spending has changed. But essentially what Apollo 11 was able to do was land people on the moon in 1969, right? And we got to look at the whole world and especially at the Soviets and say, guys, we got a person onto the moon. That's what we were all trying to do. And it was a big screw you to the Soviets and a big win for the States. And we didn't stop our winning there, as Trump would like to say, but the U.S. went to the moon 6 more times. And the Soviets were actually never able to pull it off. But 1972, this is a little bit disappointing, was the last time that we were able to send a human beyond the low Earth orbit. I know you're going to define that for us, Shane, in just a second. But we haven't done that in decades and decades and decades. And what we really saw at this point was a big shift. We'd reached our goals. We'd landed a person on the moon. And all of a sudden, space exploration began being thought of in a slightly different way.
It has to do with the fact that competition didn't exist for us anymore. The Soviet Union wasn't really able to keep up. There was nothing pushing us to achieve our goals. For every LeBron James that's out there, there has to be a Kevin Durant or somebody to push them forward and allow them to achieve their goals. We didn't really have that anymore with the slow demise of the Soviet Union. And so we became more realistic. We reeled in our budget. We were spending billions of dollars on space travel. We didn't really have the incentive to do that anymore. And so we basically stopped spending money on space travel. And it's pretty interesting to see that NASA's budget went from about 4.5% of the federal budget in the late 60s, which is a ton, down all the way to less than 1% now. It's about 0.5% of the federal budget right now. And to put it into perspective, the United States government in 2016 spent 7 times more money on diabetes treatments than it did on the space budget on funding NASA. So I think that shows you that we became more self-aware and became more focused on our mission at home, I suppose. But that didn't mean that we left space entirely. We stayed out in LEO, which is the low Earth orbit. And one thing that I didn't realize until I got very interested in space travel a few years ago is that low Earth orbit is where all of our satellites are roaming. It's where the International Space Station is. It's where the few astronauts that get launched every year go. And it's just outside our stratosphere. You know, it's only about 200 miles over top of you right now as you're listening to this podcast. If it just so happens that the International Space Station is flying over your head, it would only be about 200 miles above you. So it's really not that far. It only takes a few hours to get there into low Earth orbit. It's not nearly as dramatic and technological a challenge as it is to get into deep space. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the bottom line, Kate, is as you've said, we just became focused on our inner selves in the sense that we started looking at Earth far more than we started looking at space.
Right. I like to think of it as a shift in motivation. We moved from this kind of idealism. What's out there? Are we the only folks here? How far can we push the boundaries of human advancement to a little bit more practical, methodical approach to using space as really a tool to improve the lives of everyday people on the earth? Right. And just like you said, the focus started to look more internal. And so one thing that we saw was big advancements in satellite technology and really the industry in general. And so in just over a decade leading up to the year 2015, we saw an increase of $140 billion in the satellite industry. And so again, early days, it was all about the desire to look outward. Now we're shifting inward, and we want to leverage this technology to improve different areas of our lives. And we did see huge technological advancements that we all enjoy a lot today. So it's not something to be, miffed over. We saw big advancements in weather technology and predictive analytics. Military surveillance is obviously something that is all over the news today because of our ability to get satellites into space and to take pictures, really accurate zoomed in pictures. Telecommunications, that's obviously something that's unbelievable. We're actually utilizing that right now as we do a podcast from thousands and thousands of miles away in real time. And then probably lastly is GPS, right? And if you're not in a car every day like I am, maybe it's not as big of a deal to you, but nowadays no one's getting in their cars without utilizing this technology. So we did see some massive advancements from this more internal focus. But lastly, the few astronauts that were sent into space to hang out in Leo were really going to, like you said, Shane, the International Space Station. And so there are probably some misconceptions out there of as what this really is. Even if you see it as ISS, you're not really exactly sure what this whole thing is talking about in different articles. But just a little bit of background, it's a cooperative international venture involving astronauts from over 15 countries. So it really represents the world understanding that this kind of technology is going to be helpful for everyone, and they want to figure out how to get smart people out there to run tests that they can't run on Earth, namely that of zero gravity testing. And so they've been able to look at things like muscular dystrophy and just the effects of being in different environments. And we've actually seen a lot of huge massive advancements because people have been able to go out there. So think of these astronauts less as Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, these really masculine folks that are in super great shape that are going out to pioneer new lands, and think about it kind of like the guys in the science labs. They just happen to be floating around in space in order to run their experiments.
Nice summary. So you can see that we were on this massive trajectory. If you would have asked people, imagine in the 1960s, where we would be by 2015, this sci-fi sounding year, they probably would have thought we'd be on Mars by now or beyond, or living in space. Because think about the fact that we didn't even have the internet yet, but we were already landing people on the moon. But that trajectory has really, really slowed down, as we've tried to just show here. We've been focused on the internal efforts, and those have been interesting efforts at the International Space Station and with satellite progress. It's all really awesome, but I have to say, I'm disappointed. I'm really disappointed that progress hasn't continued, in the sense that we haven't been exploring space nearly as much as we did in those days when we were competitive with the Soviet Union. And we have to ask the question, why? Well, it's probably because of political reasons. It takes a lot of state-sponsored efforts to fund massive projects where you're sending people into space. And let's be totally honest, a congresswoman from the 3rd District of Arkansas cares very little about space travel because her people care probably more about getting jobs. So she's more interested in landing that new corporate contract or funding projects for improving the road systems. That's what's going to get her elected again in 2 years. And there's that constant political cycle. I think there's a real lack of vision, I would say, amongst our political class when it comes to space travel. And I'm comfortable saying that.
Yeah, so Barney Frank, who's a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, I'm just going to read a quote by him.
He's a former congressman. I don't think he's in anymore, just to be sure.
Yeah, former congressman, sorry. And here's a quote by him that just kind of sums this up a little bit. It says, "Why spend exorbitant amounts of money sending people to the far reaches of space when we have so many problems right here on Earth? Space travel is at best a luxury that the country ought not to be indulging in. It's a complete and total waste of money." So that's some pretty volatile language from the former congressman, but you can understand at least somewhat the sentiment. Countries that are worried about getting clean water and making sure their people have stable jobs that Americans, for the most part, don't have to worry quite as much about. We really live in a fairly luxurious country where we can think about these types of problems. But I wonder what you think about the congressman's quote there, Shane.
I'll say that I don't have the perspective to know exactly where he was when he made that statement, but to me, it seems very short-sighted and even ignorant to call space travel a waste of money and a luxury that we're just indulging in. It's much, much more than that. I would say space exploration is important, if not critical, and we're going to explain why. But I do want to try to be empathetic to the position that he made there, because of course people care about jobs and they care about having good roads. And so federally, we need to be focused on those missions perhaps before any others. And I recognize that these guys are not scientists, they're not futurists, they're not thinking about the kind of things that I'm thinking about, to be perfectly honest, that I'm going to share a lot more about here in the coming moments of the podcast. But maybe, Cade, the real solution here is to find a way to fund these projects outside of the federal government and outside of these politicians who are seeking re-election every 2 years. It would be awesome if we had massive grants from rich billionaires. I don't know, somebody like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos to get involved in these projects, people who would invest their own personal fortunes in space travel because they recognize the importance of it. So I do understand why the federal government wouldn't want to be spending 4.5% of its budget, but I'm going to try to outline here pretty soon why maybe we should be spending more of our budget on space travel and why there are advancements that Barney Frank maybe not thinking about at the moment.
Absolutely. I think that it has to do a little bit with how the system is set up. And we all know the collegiate system that's set up in the United States is unbelievable, right? You can talk about how we're falling behind in education, secondary school, but guess what? Everyone wants to come over here because we have access to money and people get to study things. And because they study things, we get to see returns on those things. And massive advancements that you and I don't really understand have come from, kind of one scientist in a lab puttering away for 20 years. And then all of a sudden, penicillin's on the market and millions of people don't have to die every year. And so it probably comes up with a little bit of why our system could be screwed up in this space where you don't really expect politicians that are elected for a couple of years and served a small amount of constituents. This is a much larger picture question and challenge. And so I don't really expect zeroed in congressmen and senators to really understand what we need to do in this space. And I agree with you. Maybe it shouldn't be their job to figure that out, but we do need to make sure that we have a system in the United States that's conducive for this type of exploration, this type of study. Because if anything that history has told us, it's because we're learning, it's because we invest so much in education and research that we see tons and tons of benefits from this. So I agree with you. It's a little bit nearsighted.
I think it is. And I think it also has so much to do with the fact that they just can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think a lot about investment and risk. We talk about those topics quite a bit on this podcast and how to balance those things. And I understand with space travel, the return on investment isn't there for a congressman like Barney Frank. He's not going to get reelected because he wants to spike the budget on space travel, NASA's budget or something like that. And he probably doesn't recognize the benefits that could come 10, 20, 30, 100 years down the road because we're a spacefaring civilization. Those are the things that he's not focused on. So I recognize that he doesn't see the return on investment.
Absolutely. But we also see in different studies, like even the study of economics, that there are market failures, right? Because no one person is incentivized to care about everybody else. That's why we have government in general. And so this probably needs to just raise up a level. Maybe it's not government, but it is higher level people that aren't thinking about individual people and individual constituencies and their individual problems, but trying to keep us on track as a human race for being ready for what may come our way. So that's just a little bit about why we think the senator may be wrong, but let's get practical, Shane. Let's dig in a little bit. Why would you say space exploration is so important? Do we have anything positive to show for the billions and billions we've spent?
We do. And I'm going to share 3 different points as to why I think that space travel is so important, possibly even critical to the survival of our species. And that is going to sound like a grandiose statement. So I'm going to start right there and tackle it head on right now. I think that space travel, based off of what I've read and what I've learned, this is no way me thinking originally, but based off of what I've come to understand, I think it could be necessary for the preservation of our species, which seems a little bit crazy, but you have to be thinking about the big picture here. I'm thinking way outside of a 2-year election cycle now. I'm talking about the history of species and the size of our universe. And we're talking about a universe-oriented timeline, okay? And so when we're talking about a universe-oriented timeline, I think everybody probably has an understanding that humans represent a tiny, tiny, tiny small fraction of our total existence, or at least the universe's total existence to date. We've only just showed up on the scene. And what happened on the scene before we showed up? Well, on our planet, which is, again, just a tiny, tiny speck of dust inside of our massive galaxy, which is inside of a massive universe with several other galaxies, if not hundreds and thousands of galaxies, we've seen 5 mass extinctions. So in Earth's history, 5 mass extinctions where at least 85% of all living species on the Earth at the time were wiped out. we're talking catastrophic. The only things remaining being some bacteria forms that later led into new forms of species that later led to another mass extinction event. So yeah, we're talking about hundreds of millions of years ago with some of these cases, but the fact that we just represent such a small time in this entire scale shows me that as long as we're going to stick around, the likelihood of another mass extinction event is very possible. I mean, the reality, Cade, I say this all the time, is that the universe is trying to kill us all the time. We are fragile. This is a hostile place that we've inherited. The Earth happens to be less hostile than the rest of the universe, but there's no reason for me to believe that our species might not be next. And there's a couple of things that could doom us in. So think about a supernova. A supernova is when a star dies. It's like the most explosive, energetic event in the universe, in the known universe that we've ever been able to record. It's proven at this point, or relatively proven, I guess, that if a supernova occurred within 30 light years of Earth, that's it for Earth. Another example would be a black hole entering our solar system. And apparently black holes do enter different solar systems every few 100 million years. So if a black hole enters into our solar systems, I can't even begin to describe the physical process of what happens, but that's the end. What about an asteroid? This is a common one that people talk about all the time because it's already happened once. An asteroid struck this Earth, and it was one of those 5 major catastrophic events that I talked about. It was the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, according to many scientists. I guess that can be debated, and I won't try to begin to do that. But what is not debatable is whether or not an asteroid or a comet could be on trajectory and hit Earth and do catastrophic damage. There's others that we talk more frequently about. Those are kind of the far-fetched scientific ones that people don't think about because they occur very infrequently. But what about the things that we are more aware of, like a nuclear holocaust? Just last week, Cade, in episode 15 of the Pseudo Scholars, we talked about a nuclear holocaust. Eventually on this podcast, we're going to talk about climate change. We haven't done that yet, but we know that we have this basic protective layer that prevents us from being sucked out into the universe where we would instantly die. It's the atmosphere. What if there was damage done to our atmosphere via climate change or other processes? And then what about artificial intelligence, which I know seems very far-fetched, but we'll cover that in one of these episodes one day. And basically what you get, Cade, after all of this is a summary of things that could kill us at any time. And it's not so far-fetched to think that it could happen again in the history of our humanity. Will it happen next year? Probably not. But could it happen in the near future? I have no reason to believe that it would not.
The point is well taken that really everything is relative. It's relative to the time scale. It's relative to size. So it's really important not to think about this in a very standard way. These are not standard questions. These events that have, scientists believe have happened are not standard events. And so it is important to kind of challenge your thinking if this isn't something that makes you at least a little bit uncomfortable, because the fact of the matter is we do have sources that are telling us that these are real possible things. And again, I like that you pointed it out. These are not just natural circumstances that may happen. We as human beings also are a huge threat to our own civilization. Kim Jong is way too close to, nuclear proliferation and all types of warheads going off at once, and all of a sudden we could be gone. And so the problems are real, and people do need to pay attention. But one thing
I know it seems a bit like a doomsday message here, and we have this message regularly in Pseudo Scholars, but I like that you said it requires a change of frame in mind, because we think very much day to day, even hour to hour. In the Marine Corps, we thought meal to meal, because that's what survival was about when you're in really rigorous training. You're just thinking about making it to lunchtime. So, of course, we have no perception of the real time scale that you tried to draw on. We're just thinking about survival of the next day. We're not thinking about the next 1 million years in the future of our species. So I understand why people don't think about a black hole entering into our universe or into our solar system maybe as much as I think about it.
And the Pseudo Scholars podcast, I just want to be clear, is not saying that every single person needs to be concerned with these things. We're simply bringing up a topic that a lot of people don't know a lot about, that we think it's really important that we are putting, some amount of money and some amount of our, enterprise knowledge as a people group towards thinking about these types of problems, because of the scale at which any changes could really affect us, right? So we know day to day it's probably more important to have a police officer enforcing laws, but that those laws, those speeding laws, are not going to cause the mass extinction of mankind. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about. So it's just a different frame of mind to have when we're talking about this. But Shane, just to give us a little bit more that kind of the exclamation point on this point specifically, we go to the late great Stephen Hawking. He's actually not late; he's still alive. But the Cambridge dean of physics that's made a lot of advancements in this type of thinking. But he just has a really powerful quote where he says he doesn't think that the human race is going to be able to survive for even the next 1,000 years unless we spread into space. He sees this specifically as the path forward, and he cites all of the same types of issues that we've talked about: global warming, genetically engineered viruses. That's another one that we didn't touch on, that he thinks are more likely to increase in the future. And what he talks about is really that with increased technology becomes increased risk, because we no longer have one submachine gun that can kill 70 people in a matter of seconds. We have one nuclear warhead that could kill 1 million people in a matter of minutes. And so the world is changing, right? The scale for potential value and destruction are both increasing at the same rate. So just probably one of those things where it's like, listen to Stephen Hawking. He's a scholar in this space, and what he is proposing is that space exploration and colonizing other planets is really the path forward.
And I think it comes down to this question of, do we care enough about the future of humanity to back up the hard drive? Because we know that the hard drive is going to crash at some point in the future, but it's going to be a lot of effort to back up the hard drive, because you're going to have to go to the store. Cade, we were just talking about backing up our Bitcoin with a hardware wallet. Bitcoin is soaring right now. We had to sneak that in here halfway through the episode. By the way, if you would have bought Bitcoin when we told you to buy Bitcoin some weeks back, it's gone up like $1,000 per Bitcoin. So we should just mark that point in time. Anyways, we were just talking about how we have Bitcoin, but we don't want to back it up on our hardware wallet because it takes money and it takes effort. But that's what we're talking about here. Eliminating the risk of a catastrophic event deteriorating all of human history, or putting in the additional effort to back up the hard drive. And really building planetary redundancy would protect against Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law says that anything bad that can happen will happen. I have no reason not to believe that the same is true with our species. But there are different thoughts about how to go forward with this. There's different thoughts about what our future in space ought to look like. So it's important to bring those up. I'll just share two of the main billionaires who have different views on this, contradictory views. Elon Musk, as many people know, wants to colonize Mars. He believes in putting 1 million people on Mars because it's going to take 1 million people to get a civilization going, yada, yada, yada. But that's what he thinks the future is. So we're going to need suits. We're going to need habitats. We're going to have to pull off The Martian. If you haven't seen the movie or read the book, which is far better, check it out. That's Elon Musk's vision. Whereas Jeff Bezos, he also recognizes the need to get into space and has started a company surrounding that called Blue Origin, a rocket company. But he thinks that the future of space is living between big floating space stations, like the International Space Station, but on a grander scale, really sci-fi style, living in spaceships out there in space and doing the majority of our industry work out there in space so that we can preserve Earth, which seems to be the greatest location so far that we found in the universe for humans to survive. So both these guys recognize that we need to start protecting against Murphy's Law. We need to start thinking about a future. There's just different strategies about how to go forward.
I would challenge anyone that doesn't know a lot about this topic or hasn't seen some of the amazing pictures that we have from people being out in space, go check them out. Because when you see Neil Armstrong taking a picture of the Earth from a view that no human being had ever seen before, or the fact that Buzz Aldrin walked over on the dark side of the moon and was able to view something that no one else had ever been able to view before. This is not just pragmatic, right? This is not just about the advancement in trying to keep our species alive. Surely that's a big point, and if there was no other point, that's probably sufficient to make sure that we continue to invest and do this. But becoming a spacefaring civilization would be really, really cool. Like the fact that we have people that have seen the fact that our Earth is a sphere and they've observed it with their own eyes because they sat on the moon while they watched it rotate. I mean, that's an amazing thing to think about. And so, what kind of species are we really if we're not pushing the limits of what seems possible? I can't be the only one out there that feels this kind of instinctual call to rise above the monotony of the day and seek for something better. I mean, it feels very habitual and natural to human beings. I mean, you think about what the earth used to be. It was just kind of this big rock with a bunch of overgrown weeds and water everywhere. And it was like, we're cultivating the earth. We're subduing it. We're wrestling it to the ground. We're taking this thing that is so much bigger than us and using our minds to try to become masters of it. And that's really what we're talking about when it comes to space, right? And it is absolutely mind-blowing to know that we have a couple of scientists and a couple of mathematicians that can do some work on a chalkboard and make it such that Buzz Aldrin could land on the moon. I mean, that's so cool. And I think that is something that we as a human being, people are called to cultivate this universe and subdue it.
And we're continuing to talk about reasons for advancing this technology and pushing ourselves forward. And we have to recognize that there have been many technologies that have been advanced already because of space travel and because of the organization NASA. So a lot of people don't know, but there have been massive amounts of technologies formulated because of NASA's research. So some of those would be the MRI and CAT scan machines, cordless drills, the car tires that your car sits on right now, smoke detectors, water filters, solar energy, long-distance telecommunications, prosthetic limbs. These are all inventions and discoveries that actually came from NASA-specific research into space exploration. So those are just day-to-day functional things that we've learned about. But there's so much more that we'll continue to learn about by becoming this space-faring civilization, a civilization that's interested in going out and not just looking back.
Survival, practical inventions, and it's instinctual to the human beings, right? That's what we're talking about. But one other question, Shane, that we definitely have to hit on is, does life exist beyond Earth? So there's a lot of things about Earth that we know we're extremely finely tuned to have life on Earth. And if we were any further away from the sun or any closer, we would be in big, big trouble. And you know, I don't actually have the analogy with me now, but basically it is unbelievably small odds that there is another Earth out there. But then you ask the question, well, let's multiply those odds times the thousands and thousands and thousands of galaxies and the, you know, that exist within the universe. And then all of a sudden, maybe it becomes a little more simple of a question that there could be life outside of the universe.
Definitely. This is another reason we have to be considering space exploration. We have to find out if there's another form of life that exists out there. And I think there is. I've just spent way too much time investigating the Fermi paradox, which is basically what you've just described, Cade. When you consider the exact size and scope of the universe as far as we understand it, how could there not be other forms of life? Well, there's basically 3 reasons that I'm not going to get into now. We'll do that on another episode, maybe an episode on the Fermi paradox. But it just seems highly unlikely that our tiny, tiny corner of the universe is the only spot where life exists. And if we want to take it a step further, maybe it's the only spot, or is it the only spot where life could exist? So I suspect that there are other forms of life, but I also suspect there's other forms of planetary living that would be available to us if we could just get out there. And it's a massive challenge, but it's a challenge that we've been undertaking now just probably over the last 2 years, and we're starting to see some big spending improvements, I guess you would say. Trump seems to be very pro space travel. This is one of the things that I've been really appreciative about the president so far. I don't know if this is actually translated. The budget hasn't been signed, but I know he's talking about increasing the budget. And I know that he seems to be interested in space travel and pushing the limits in this world. So I think we need to talk about what the future of space travel holds.
Absolutely, but I lastly want to just touch on the Fermi paradox. Really, go wiki it. It really is incredible because it's all theoretical and futuristic, but you know, look at the points on both sides. There's plenty of people that point out why he might be wrong or why he might be right, but it really is interesting because it's not a really data-driven decision. There's obviously some odds there that maybe you can take into account, but really think about it, right? Think about how important it would be if we could find life outside of the universe. Maybe that changes your opinion a little bit, but yeah, absolutely. Good point, Shane.
What's
the future of space travel.
Yeah, I guess what's coming down the road. We know what we want to see, Cade, but what are we going to see in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so things that we know are on the radar. 2018. So NASA has announced that it's going to launch Orion 45,000 miles past the moon. So what's really cool about that is it's not going to have a person, but is a human-capable vessel. So what we're doing is it's somewhat of a pretest that we know if this human-capable vehicle can get outside and survive, then we know theoretically that someone could be inside of that vehicle at some point in time. And basically what we're saying is get out of here, production possibilities frontier. We're lifting that ceiling up another 45,000 miles, which is significant compared to where we've been in the past.
Yeah, and we're talking about deep space now. We're not talking about low Earth orbit anymore. Low Earth orbit is a little bit rinky-dink at this point. We can do it in our sleep. We launch rockets in our sleep. When you watch the SpaceX videos on YouTube, they're all going into low Earth orbit. The next level is getting back out to the moon, where we were last in 1972. But it sounds like this mission is intended to go 45,000 miles past, just to run some tests, run some stressors before we put any humans in there and really push the limit. But Cade, that's all part of NASA's program that's attempting to get to Mars. That is the end state. They're not just trying to get back to the moon, although they will go back to the moon. Do you know anything about that session, that mission?
Well, what I know is what everyone should be asking. Did we ever go to the moon in the first place? So
if you're not sure, listen to the Joe Rogan episode with Eddie Bravo, where they just go into the ridiculous proselytizing and conspiracy theories behind whether or not we made it.
Hey, maybe so, but you look at the pictures, the flag doesn't seem to be waving. We haven't been back in a few decades. I don't know what's going on, but no, it really is important, because landing a person on the moon was so monumental. You know, and when Neil Armstrong says it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, what was the giant leap? There wasn't a lot of practical value that we got from being on the moon. It was just this massive advancement. It was just man saying, I can do this. And that is so fundamental to how I think it inspired Americans. It was a part of a really thriving time in American history. And so moving back towards something like that and validating that we can get back there, re-solidify that the moon can now be a next launching point, potentially to other places. And so all of that is really exciting for us to reproduce, being able to get back there for the first time since 1972. But you talked about it, right? It's all about getting to Mars. And it's really fascinating. We can't cover all of the reasons why Mars is the most livable planet within our solar system. But if you look at the other options, they're not too great. And when I look at the insurmountable odds it seems like it would take to build a civilization on Mars, I say, oh my goodness. But then I look and say, what have human beings done in the last 10 years? And why couldn't we figure that out at some point in time?
Definitely. So the manned mission to Mars, that's the fun one. That's the sexy one that everybody's thinking about. It's exciting that NASA's got this mission and has taken this challenge and is going after it, because we've stopped for, as we said, decades. We are going after it. You can go on the website and look at NASA's road ahead and see the exact plans on each year, their projections on how they're going to get closer and closer until they finally launch that mission. Elon Musk is trying to do the same thing. He says that his big rocket's going to be the one that gets us there. We know other people are interested in this inside of the privatized space world. So, Kate, I think the future is bright or dark. If you're out into space, it gets pretty dark out there. But the bottom line, I guess we can say, is that maybe we are back entering into that trajectory point that people got to live in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and then into the late 1960s. Can you imagine how exciting it would have been? You just started to echo that. But for us in our lifetime, since we missed that one, it's going to be Mars, and it's going to happen in the next decade, if I had to guess, based off of the assumptions and projections that I've been reading about.
I've talked about the Wonder Years before, but it really is a cool kind of, rewind in time when you see the kids all sitting in their John F. Kennedy High School. John F. Kennedy, I think, had been assassinated at that point, and they're all watching the NASA landing on the moon, and they're getting the reports back, and it was like everyone's imagination was captured, and it is really cool. But we got to zoom back and say, why is it happening now? It's because competition's back, right? Maybe not multinational competition with the Russians, or maybe that's more covert. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? But it's because we have some really forward thinkers, powerful people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and NASA, who are challenging collectively each other. But that should always be a positive thing. I think we always have an optimistic view of what that kind of competition breeds, because what it really is it becomes this race to see who can be more ingenious in their methods, and who can get the funding, and who can solve the problems and get the resources and things like that. So all I'm saying is that we're back in a more competitive playing ground, as we have people that have mastered some problems on Earth and are starting to think about the problems beyond.
So as space tourism starts to become a reality, and potentially manned missions to Mars in our lifetime, and if Elon gets it right, he's going to be trying to send people. Are you going to go?
Who knows? Because I think that finances might be a little bit of an issue, because I know that even today you can actually buy a spot to go to the International Space Station, but it only costs you a cool $60 million. So I'm not sure if I'm going to have that kind of dough, but I mean, who knows, right? It's one of those things where people used to be afraid to get in a plane, And if they are afraid still, and I still get a little bit afraid on planes, I have to try to overcome it by being rational and saying I've got a better chance of dying in a car, even though I feel safer. And so, who knows what we could do. I'm not sure I want to be the first guy to test out that vehicle that's going 45,000 miles beyond the moon, but who knows? Maybe a little bit down the road. I know that's something you're probably interested in.
I'm in. Sign me up. I would go tomorrow. The only thing I would have a problem with is motion sickness because it's brutal and I get motion sickness, but that's a problem for another day. I think that we've shown, Cade, hopefully, that space travel is such an exciting topic, if nothing else. And it is a reality that's coming back into our world, and we're going to start seeing massive improvements and big gains reached by different organizations over the next decade or so. Probably, I said decade to Mars. It's really more like 13 years based on the projection. And it's going to be fun to watch closely and participate if possible.
Yeah, and in summary, space exploration really contains the answer to some really practical questions and practical problems, right? Practical advancements in technology, existential problems, and then also just instinctual problems, right? Us as human beings want to conquer the earth. I hope that's kind of what we were able to lay out as the vision and the summary for why this is important, why everyone should pay a little bit more attention.
Well said. All right, kid, that's all I've got for this week. We'll be back next week. And until then, I will see you later, little brother.
All right. See you, big brother.